Okay, good morning. So, before we start with a new lesson, let's try to warm up with this flashcard. Even before we do that, let me tell you that tentatively I'm planning to have another quiz next week, 1 week from today. So today is 28 February, Thursday. Exactly next Thursday. I will confirm it on Tuesday, whether we definitely are going to have it or not. But by and large, I think we should, because it's useful to have 3 before the midterm, so that after the midterm we don't have to rush with the quizzes. We are more relaxed about it. Okay, so prepared some flashcards with respect to the Mundell-Fleming model, the one that we saw recently. So what is the key assumption in this model? Remember, this model is about a small open economy. What is the key assumption?
So interest rates are fixed at R star.
At R star. First of all, what is R star? Number 2, wide are these peaks? So that's the consequence of the assumption. What is the assumption?
So that if the interest rate goes below the international rate, all of the capital will flow out because capital is perfectly mobile.
That's the assumption. So again, what is the assumption?
Capital is perfectly mobile.
That there is perfect capital mobility. Okay, now you have exhausted your, now I would like to hear everybody else. Sorry, I want to show you. Okay, so that it's a small economy with perfect capital mobility. As a consequence, R is equal to R star, and as a consequence, in the goods market equilibrium equation, investment is now a function of R star, which is no longer the endogenous variable in the model. It's now exogenous, set by international conditions. Okay. What is the IS curve in the Mundell-Fleming model? Yes?
Relationship between the income and exchange rate.
The relation between the income and the exchange rate, it's not complete. Just any relation or a particular relation?
Negative.
A negative relation that will come next, but what is special about when you are on the IS curve as opposed to when you are not? When you are not, you're also in the exchange rate output graph, but you're not on the curve. What is different? If you are on the IS curve, suppose this is the Y E IS star. What is different being here rather than being here, say? Is the difference? The difference is, anybody? Come on, this is really basic.
The interest rates are fixed.
That's not the difference. The interest rate is fixed also here. It's fixed everywhere. That's why we use E here, not R. This is the very definition of the IS curve. What is the IS curve? Let me rephrase the question. What is the IS curve?
Goods market and inequilibrium.
Exactly. So, what is different between those 2 points?
On IS curve, the good market is in equilibrium, while on that point, the market is not in equilibrium.
It is not in equilibrium, right? So you have to complete your definition by saying complete it now.
The negative relationship between the interest rate, income and the exchange rate, while on the ISCA
Where the good market is in equilibrium. Okay? That's the key part. Again, I made this mistake. Instead of pressing here, it's early morning and I'm not sharp. You know, it's where the good market is in equilibrium. That's crucial. Okay. Next. Now, the shape of the IS curve, we kind of covered this just now. Shape of the IS curve in the MF model, in the Mandel-Fleming model, it's a downward sloping. Why?
because of the inverse relationship between exchange rate and income.
Why is that inverse relationship?
Because when our income or output increases, imports decrease. Imports increase. This caused the exchange rate to fall.
You took it from the wrong end. Yes?
When exchange rate increases, our net export increases, as a consequence, our output is outside.
Yes. So that's the right approach. So when the exchange rate increases, then your net exports decrease, and therefore your output also decreases. Okay? It's a downward sloping shape because the lower exchange rate increases net exports and also output. Okay. What about the Allen curve in the Mandel-Fleming model? What is the Allen curve? Should be easy now. Yes? Allen curve? When the money market or the financial market is in equilibrium. Okay? All right. So how is the general equilibrium? I mean, both markets. What does it look like in the Mandel-Fleming model? Well, this is kind of difficult to say in words. It's expressed by the two conditions, right? One is the equilibrium in the goods market, and the other is the equilibrium condition in the financial market. So how do we say this in words? Yes?
So IS is equal to L.
Sorry?
IS is equal to L.
No. How do we first, okay, that's true, but this first one, how do we describe it in words? Instead of saying y is equal c plus I plus g plus nx, let's say it in words.
Equilibrium in the goods market.
Okay, but that's not what I mean, because obviously, yes. When is that happening? When that equality holds. So which equality holds? The equality between
Income and exchange rate. So I don't get the question.
Does it say here y equal E? Does it say here y equal exchange rate? It doesn't, right? It says y output produced equal planned expenditure. That's the equation in words. Where the output produced, the production, is equal to planned expenditure. And what about this one?
Y
Exactly, yes. Okay. This one you could see easily. This one, for some reason, you were blind to it. Okay. This first, this is very easy, definition of kind. What is a floating exchange rate? Just definition. What is a floating exchange rate? Before taking any such class economics, you don't know what is floating. What is the word floating mean? Flexible. I will use another word. What is a flexible exchange rate?
To keep itself on surface, above surface.
That's a very literal definition of the word floating. That's correct. Now we are in economics, so we are talking about exchange rates. So let's replace floating with flexible. What does the word floating means? That it can move, basically. When something is floating in the water, it's moving around, right? Depending on where the stream takes it. So, replace it with flexible. What is your definition of that?
Variable exchange.
Right, that's synonymous, but what does it mean?
Let's keep changing itself due to
But why?
output.
Why? Why will it change? That the exchange rate? Come on, let's come up with a
Because
definition. Let's
output.
make that effort.
Due to output, net exports.
The exchange rate is just like, what is the exchange rate? The exchange rate is a price, right? It's the price of a currency. How is generally price of anything, the price of this bag determined? How is it determined? If nobody wanted this bag, what would be the price of this bag? Right, so what are the determinants of the price of this bag?
It's demand,
Demand on one side and the other?
supply,
Supply. So what are the determinants of the exchange rate?
demand and supply.
The
Demand and supply.
demand and supply. So is the exchange rate determined by the equilibrium exchange rate determined by market forces, by supply and demand, right? It says something totally different, but the substance is the same. It changes when economic conditions change, and due to those, supply and demand will also change. Okay? Now, what is the fixed exchange rate?
Constant. That's one.
It's the exchange rate, obviously fixed means constant, that the central bank sets by stepping in and satisfying any difference between supply and demand in the currency market. Right? So the central bank will be a very active player in the foreign currency market to keep the exchange rate fixed. Okay? So what about the fiscal policy in a closed economy? What do we know about fiscal policy in a closed economy? What effect does it have?
Shifts the IS curve.
Correct. And in a world where we have goods markets and financial markets, what is the consequence of that shift? Yes?
Whenever the shifts occur in IS curve, real interest rate changes accordingly and it changes the rate of investment.
Right. So, in other words, since the interest rate changes, what do we have? We have
Investment changes.
crowding out due to falling investment, right? Okay. This is something we did like several weeks ago. Should know by now about this. This was the closed economy. What about in a small open economy with fixed exchange rate? What does fiscal policy do? Yes?
It changes the net export according to the nominal exchange rate. Or crowds out the exports in the small economy.
Are you sure? This is with fixed exchange rate. Why would net exports change with fixed exchange rates? Yes?
There is no change in the interest rate.
The interest rate in a small open economy is by assumption set at the international level, so it's not changing. The interest rate. The exchange rate is fixed in this case. So what is the fiscal policy doing in such a case?
Increasing the output.
Increases the output. So that means that there is no
Change in exchange. There is no change in nominal exchange rate.
there is no crowding out. Right? There is no crowding out. Okay? That is with fixed exchange rate. So, what happens in the Mander-Fleming model with flexible exchange rate? Flexible. If the government trade policy reduces imports, so say the government applies a tariff reducing imports, what happens in the Mander-Fleming model? Yes? Flexible exchange rate.
The exchange rate appreciates.
Right. Why?
Because supply of the domestic currency on the market is decreasing.
Supply is decreasing. Why?
Because imports are decreasing.
Okay. And? So you said half of the story. Half of the story is that the exchange rate appreciates, goes up. Yes?
That will cause exports to become more expensive, so the exports will fall, which will lead to the crowding out of the net exports.
Well, rather than crowding out of net exports, here we are talking about imports versus exports. So we are still within the net exports. So it will lead to no change in net exports eventually. It's not some external factor that crowds out net exports, but it's falling imports followed by increase in exchange rate and decrease in exports. And graphically, why is the exchange rate going up? Again?
Net exports increasing because of reduced input.
Okay, so graphically,
Highest
what's
curve
happening?
to the right.
Highest curve is shifting to the right. True. So why is that shift to the right of the highest curve moving up the exchange rate?
Because the market needs to be in equilibrium. So
Because the Allen curve is
vertical.
vertical. And that is a reflection of the fact that
Interest rate is
that there is only one level of income for given money supply at which the money market can remain in equilibrium. Income cannot increase or decrease. Okay, so reduction in imports cause the NX curve to shift outwards. You know, the NX compared to the exchange rate. So this will move the IS curve to the right. Okay? Now, because the LM curve is vertical, then E will go up. And because of that, exports will go down, but output or income is not affected. So what happens if the risk premium, remember we talked about the risk premium, theta increases. What happens in that case? Yes?
So if theta increases, the risk premium goes up, and that causes more investment.
Why would it cause more
Also less
investment?
investment.
Risk premium means that the local interest rate is higher, the local cost of investing is higher, so it's less investment.
And so all investment goes out of the country because
So,
capital is-
no, that's a different type of, that's investment that goes out of the country, is the savers that bring their money out of the country. This is investment which costs more, so it goes down, and that shifts the IS curve to the left. Is that the end of the story?
So then exchange rates will fall.
That's true, but is it only the IS curve that moves? Yes?
it also shifts the LM curve to the right. Because now the
Why? Why would the LM curve shift to the right? Yes?
Interest rate has been affected. Risk premium.
That, as we saw, will affect the investment on the goods market side. You're talking about the LM curve. I mean, that also works on the LM curve side, but not investment. So what is it being affected by?
Saving.
No, on the LM curve. But remember, what is the LM curve again? Money demand and money supply. So money supply is set by the central bank, so it must have to do with money demand. Okay, so what happens when the risk premium goes up to money demand? It decreases, right? Because it's the cost of holding money is higher. So it decreases. So that's what pushes the LM curve to the right. Okay? Oops. As I said, I'm not. Okay, so the interest rate increases due to a higher risk premium. So IS star shifts to the left because investment falls, and LM shifts right because money demand falls. Okay. So overall, what are the two effects? The two effects are first, drop in exchange rate. Second, increase in income. Okay? And we have the last one. No? Where is the last one? Gone. There should have been one more. Yes, there it is. Give 3 reasons why an increase in risk premium may not always lead to an increase in income. We saw that the increase in income is due to basically the decrease in exchange rates, which will encourage net exports, exports and net exports. And the decrease in exchange rate in turn was determined by not only by the shift to the left of the S curve, but also the shift to the right of the LM curve. So what are the three reasons why that LM curve may not actually shift to the right? We said LM curve will shift to the right because interest rate will be higher due to the risk premium. And therefore money demand will decrease. So what are three things that can prevent the LM curve from shifting to the right? What if the central bank does not like the idea of the exchange rate going down? What will it do? It will reduce the money supply so that there is no excess demand in the money market, excess supply in the money market, and therefore the LM curve will not shift to the right. Okay? So that's one possibility. Second possibility?
So consumers might start holding on to more money because of the increased risk.
Right. Because why they would want to hold on more money?
So because times are difficult and like there's a lot of risk associated
With higher risk, money is a safer asset than other less liquid assets. Are you holding more money now, given the times? No? So you're not assessing this risk as to, this is business as usual, basically. Is it?
Interest rates are.
Well, we hope it's business as usual. We hope it doesn't degenerate. So next, what is the final one? The final reason, what would it be? Yes? You are ready to respond when I see your nice cap. It's like military, colors. No, nothing to do with it. It's actually dogs, bears, and flowers, nothing to do with it. Okay, so what is the third reason? We were assuming throughout this that prices were fixed, but relax this assumption for a moment. What will when the exchange rate goes down, what will that do to the price level?
So it will fall.
Why would it fall?
And that is
So suppose the exchange rate in this country, the rupee is losing value. So the dollar is going through the roof, 150, 60, 200, 300. You expect prices here to fall? What do you expect?
price will rise.
Exactly. Why?
So because exchange rate is, net exports are rising.
Because the price of the things we import will be higher.
Yeah.
So since the price of imports, starting from oil, which is required it's a cost of production, will be higher, so then that will be reflected in a higher price level. And so the higher price level now completes the proposition. What happens with the higher price level? Any idea? Where is the price level entering? In the equilibrium, in the overall equilibrium. Where do you see the price level?
The interest rate will rise.
So you have two equations, right? One is y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. The other is money supply equal money demand. So what is the price level?
Money supply.
Money supply, right? So what happens when the price level increases? Money supply decreases, right? So that is another way for money supply to decrease. So one way is if the central bank intentionally lowers the nominal money supply to match the decrease in money demand. Another is if, due to higher price of imports, price level increases and that decreases real money supply. Okay? All right. Brilliant work. Where is the place to log out? There. Oops, I also closed the wrong one. Okay. Now, I want to show you some cases of exchange rate crisis. So cases where we had fixed exchange rates, but then because of all kind of economic pressures, that system of fixed exchange rates suddenly collapsed, dramatically collapsed, and there was a strong devaluation of the currency in a very short period of time, frequently just overnight. Okay, so we will look at Mexico in the 90s, we will look at Turkey in 2000, 2001, we will look at Southeast Asia in 97. And then we will talk about China. Even though China did not see a currency devaluation, it's also interesting on its own right, we will see why. So we will talk about what happened after the financial crisis of 2008. Many countries used basically competitive devaluations of their currency, and so people started talking about currency as a weapon, so currency wars. Then we will see the aggregate demand curve for the small open economy. So in the Mandel-Fleming model, we will remove the assumption of fixed prices. And this we will do for sure. Then if we have time, we will move on to the next topic, which is money supply determination. But that is if any time remains. So let's first, remember last time I closed the lecture by telling you about what is good about floating exchange rates and what is good about flexible exchange rates. So I was arguing, or maybe I didn't argue because I didn't have time for that, I will argue now, that with floating exchange rates, as we have seen, you can use monetary policy for achieve goals such as economic growth and low inflation. With fixed exchange rates, you achieve certainty of the exchange rate. So when you are trading, you hate the idea that the exchange rate can be volatile, can go up or down. And so the fixed exchange rate will facilitate international transactions. Okay? Some people also argue that the fact that you can have monetary policy, free monetary policy, is not always good because the government may have the wrong incentives, may try to finance its own debt with money supply, with issuing money. So by having a fixed exchange rate, that is no longer possible. It disciplines monetary policy. it destines monetary policy to achieving the fixed exchange rate, so you can no longer use it to finance ever increasing public deficits. You know, throwing money behind PIA, trying to support PIA, which is a money losing business, it's a loss-making business, and so if you have a fixed exchange rate, it becomes more difficult for a government to do that. Now, let's try to understand how can a crisis occur in a system of fixed exchange rate. So remember this relationship, which we call the uncovered interest parity relation. It said that the domestic interest rate must be equal to the foreign interest rate minus any exchange rate change. And this relation was coming from which consideration? How did we derive this relationship?
Relative purchasing power parity.
No, that was another story.
Uncovered interest parity relation.
Yeah, that's that one. But where did we derive it from? The relative purchasing power parity comes from the relation between from the definition of real exchange rate as the ratio of domestic prices and foreign prices expressed in the same currency, and then the relative purchasing power parity means that this is constant. So if this is constant, then any change in the nominal exchange rate is due only to differentials in inflation between domestic and foreign economies. Here we are talking about relation between interest rate, domestic and foreign, and exchange rate. So where is this coming from? What was the consideration that enabled us to derive that relationship? It's something that if you attend any finance course, you will hear a lot. It's called no arbitrage condition. So there should be no room, no opportunity for making money by investing across borders, by investing money across borders. The return from investing across borders should be equal. That's where we derive this from. Okay, now given this, okay, if there are expectations that, so, you know, given that when the exchange rate is fixed, this term is 0, so these two must be equal. But when there are expectations that the exchange rate is about to being devalued, then one tool the central bank may try to use in order to stop those expectations, to correct those expectations, is to increase the domestic interest rate, to entice people into, you know, thinking that investing here it's good, and so increasing the demand for the local currency. Okay, so that's this. Before that, they will try to convince markets that they have no intention of devaluing, but that generally will not work, because if the expectation was there in the first place, whatever they say, that is only, you know, normally not regarded, it's regarded as cheap talk, it's not credible. And the final choice, if neither of these work, will be just to devalue the currency. Okay, so let's start with the first case study, Mexico, before we go for a short break. So this was the Mexican peso to dollar exchange rate up to somewhere in the middle of 94. And then you see what happens. There is a devaluation, a strong drop. So this was a fixed, almost fixed exchange rate. And then suddenly the central bank basically ran out of foreign reserves, so it could no longer ensure that rate, so it had to devalue. Then it further, once it became floating, it further went down before stabilizing eventually. Okay, so what was going on? Why did that happen? So first of all, what did that cause? You know, the sudden devaluation. Obviously, the exchange rate in Mexico being much lower meant the dollar becoming much more expensive to Mexicans. So US firms lost revenue for their sales to Mexico, and there were many bankruptcies in the US. And of course, many people in US had invested in Mexico. Those assets became worth less. Now, what caused this, all this crisis? This happened in 94, because before that, Mexico was an attractive place for foreign investment. In 94, there were some events. There was a peasant uprising, farmers uprising. There was an assassination of leading presidential candidate, similar to what happened here in 2007. And also, in the US, the interest rate was increased several times. So that's the foreign interest rate for Mexico. It's R star for Mexico, okay? So that was increasing. So you see that when R star increases, that creates downward pressure on your exchange rate, okay? So because of these events, the central bank was trying to prop up the exchange rate by selling dollars. But what was going on with the reserves? You see, in December 93, they were 28 billion, 94, 17 billion, and December, 9 billion. December 15, 7 billion. So they were becoming depleted. Sounds familiar? I was reading the last few months of 2018 about the State Bank of Pakistan foreign reserves, that now they have only this much foreign reserves, and then it's again lower and lower and lower, and then what was happening after that? You know, the dollar became first was, it all started, it was around 105, then it became suddenly one fine day 120, then one other fine day it became 130, and then one other fine day when the reserves were running even lower, it became 140 almost. Now it's 139 or 140. So it's a very similar story, you know. And because of this depleting reserves, suddenly there is that sudden drop in the exchange rate. So this means basically, if you want to interpret it in the framework of what we have done, that the theta, the premium, risk premium, is higher. So everybody is pulling their capitals out of Mexico. And because of that, that amounts to exceptional pressure on the currency. The central bank has no reserves to match that, so it has to abandon the fixed rate and let the exchange rate float. So it falls, as we have seen in the graph. Okay. Then after that, there was a rescue package and confidence was restored, and then there was a recovery after that. Okay. So this was the case of Mexico. Now, before looking at the remaining cases and then moving on. Let's have a short break. Okay, so another interesting case study is the one of Turkey. You can see in 2001, this was the exchange rate, Turkish lira to the dollar. It was around slightly less than 700,000 Turkish lira to a dollar, which was already a lot. But overnight, it jumped to more than 1 million Turkish lira to a dollar. And then it floated. Okay, so that's another example of strong devaluation. Now we can see behind that devaluation, so there was a crisis in the banking sector, which was the cause. But because of that, you can see here there is the time series of inflows into, or financial inflows into Turkey and outflows out of Turkey. So you can see how the outflows spiked exactly at the time of the devaluation. When the exchange rate suddenly lost value, everybody rushed for the exit, and there was this huge spike in outflows. Another interesting thing is in this chart, which is the rate of financial arbitrage. This is what we were talking about, that there should be no arbitrage. But when there is this kind of situation with sudden devaluations, then it is possible to make money if you do it in the right way. So you see that this is expressed here. The opportunity to make money suddenly increases at the time of the crisis, which is, there was one around here, but the one I'm talking about is this one. See how the opportunity to make money suddenly spikes. Okay? So this was another case. Yet another one, third one, was in Southeast Asia, all countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. They were affected by this so-called financial contagion. And it was again originated in the banking sector. And because of that, there was outflow of financial flows. Also, foreign investors wanted to sell stock prices. So there was a drop in stock market indexes. And the exchange rate also suffered. So you can see in this table the countries which were affected by this, particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, and also Thailand. And you can see the difference between the countries in the region and a place like the US, where barely anything happened. It was business as usual. So it was a crisis for that region. Okay, now I want to talk about an interesting thing. We have been saying and showing you that if you have fixed exchange rates, you cannot use monetary policy, right? Because the monetary policy needs to be destined to ensure that the exchange rate is equal to the fundamental value. Now, why is that? Is that always the case? Why we can't use monetary policy? Because if we were to use monetary policy, then that would make the exchange rate not aligned with the official value of the exchange rate. Again, the mechanism is through capital inflows and outflows, right? It's with those capital inflows and outflows that the exchange rate will change. Because of those capital inflows and outflows, we'll have changes in the demand and supply of the currency, in the currency market, which will affect the equilibrium rate of the exchange rate. And that will make it misaligned with the official rate. So that tells you that if you were to forego, to not allow free capital flows, so if you restrict the flow of capital out of the country, then what happens? Even if you have fixed exchange rates, you can still have independent monetary policy because there is no risk of capitals flowing out of the country. You control that. Right? You get the point? You follow? No? You get lost? Why is it that we said that with fixed exchange rates we can't use monetary policy for stimulating the economy?
Because the money, the exchange rate, the economy either goes into overvaluation or undervaluation.
Yeah, because we have this relationship between exchange rate and money supply. This was the exchange rate, and this was the money supply. And if the exchange rate is fixed, then the money supply should be here, at this level. If it's higher, then there will be an overvaluation. The official rate will be higher than the equilibrium. But why? Why would that happen? Why, if we increase the money supply, then this will be a problem?
Because this will eventually lead the economy, the currency to be undervalued in the future.
But what is the mechanism here?
Over
Why is the exchange rate falling with an increase in money supply?
Because when money supply increases, the interest rates rise, which cause the
No, the interest rate will not rise. When the money supply increases,
interest rates will fall.
the interest rate is
Fall.
falling. The interest rate is falling. And due to the fall in interest rate, we have
Prices will rise.
Supply of domestic currency will increase.
we have people who want to invest outside now. They don't like anymore investing in this country. So this will affect the currency market. That's why increasing money supply, the equilibrium value of the exchange rate will fall. Now, if we don't have free capital flows, then that will not happen. Even if the interest rate has changed, people will not be free to move capitals out of the country. And therefore, that will not affect the exchange. There will be no pressure on the exchange rate. So you can use money supply to achieve, stable growth, low inflation, whatever. So you have to basically choose any two of these three. You can't have all three of them, right? So you can have independent monetary policy and you can have free capital flows, but then you can't have fixed exchange rates. If you want to have free capital flows and fixed exchange rates, then you cannot have independent monetary policy. And if you want to have both fixed exchange rates and independent monetary policy, then you cannot have free capital flows. Something has to give. So you see that the US has an independent monetary policy and free capital flows, so it lets the dollar float. Hong Kong has free capital flows and fixed exchange rates, so it gave up on independent monetary policy. In China is an interesting case, precisely because in China there are restrictions to capital flows. In China, you're not allowed to move capitals out of the country easily. So, therefore, you are in option 3. You have fixed exchange rate and also independent monetary policy is possible because of that. Okay? So, yes?
So if we have China's option, how will that affect the graph which you have made on the left? If we have independent monetary policy and fixed exchange rate, so even if we increase the money
No,
supply,
but if we don't have free capital flows, then this relationship is no longer there. Because once we increase money supply, there is no reason why the exchange rate should drop. The reason for the exchange rate to drop was because due to the lower interest rate, capitals were flowing out. Now they are not allowed to flow out, so that relation is not there. Okay? So if you read this slide now, with the complaints by US about China that has a cheap currency and therefore an unfair advantage, and the President Bush at that time asking China to let the currency float, and others want tariffs on Chinese goods. It applies exactly the same today. Just replace Bush with Trump, and the rest, it applies exactly the same today. This was like 15 years back. It still applies today. Okay? So, yes?
Is it unethical what China is doing, like, or
Well, wait a couple of slides and I will show you that the US also is not doing something particularly nice. But one controversy is that even if, so you know, the exchange rate is fixed in China and there is restriction on capital mobility, so in theory, removing the capital restriction, then the currency should appreciate. But actually, since it has been restricted for so long, you know, when you have a restriction, what do you do when you lift it? You want to take advantage of it, so maybe that will cause, even if the it doesn't make much economic sense, but maybe people will want to try and invest overseas, and therefore there might be capital outflows. So the currency might go down actually, instead of going down. It's already cheap, it might become even cheaper. Okay, so I was talking about the story of the financial crisis, and that after the financial crisis, many countries tried to use competitive devaluation to gain a competitive edge over competitor countries through competitive devaluation. Others used the term currency war to define this situation. Okay? And talking about US, what US was doing after the crisis, so this is in 2010, it was printing money, a lot of money, just to try to stimulate the economy after the financial crisis. But the fact that it was printing all this money, it was flooding all the foreign markets also with this money, because, you know, the dollar is the world reserve currency, so it's affecting also foreign market. So there was so-called hot money flowing around. And so this was reflected in overvalued currencies compared to the dollar. Okay? So many people were upset by this. For example, the famous economist Joseph Stiglitz was talking about against this creation of all this liquidity. And other people as well, Director for International Economics in London was saying that the US, instead of getting angry at China, should actually take a responsible position by not flooding the global markets with all this liquidity. You can see what was happening. The euro gaining value versus the dollar. The Turkish lira, so I showed you before that the Turkish lira suddenly lost value, but that was in 2000. In 2010 it was a totally different story. Because of the money supply creation in the US, the Turkish lira was gaining value against the dollar. And similarly, the Brazilian real was also gaining value. So all these so-called emerging markets, the euro not really emerging, but other markets, they were all becoming overvalued compared to the dollar. And this was creating, upsets in foreign trade, because some markets were becoming too expensive, while the US was earning a competitive edge. Okay. Now I want to talk about, going back to the theory. So in the Mundell-Fleming model, what if we remove the assumption that prices are fixed? Okay, so we basically want to derive the AD curve from the Mundell-Fleming model. Okay, so this is the equation in the goods market we are familiar with, except that now, because we are talking about changing prices, this is no longer the nominal exchange rate, but it's the real exchange rate, because actually the net exports are a function of the real exchange rate, not the nominal one. We were using the nominal one because we were assuming fixed prices. Once prices move, then it's back to real exchange rate. And this is the equality in the money market. Okay? So what happens when we increase prices? We let prices go up. This LM curve is drawn for a given price level, right? What happens when prices go up?
Shifts to the left.
So what we have here, this is R, this is Y, this is my LM curve, and this is my international interest rate, R star. So here I have Y and E. So this is my level of income, and this is my LM curve star here, right? Now, if we, so this is all happening for a given price level, P1. Okay? What happens when price goes up to P2?
And then shift to the left.
When price goes up to P2, basically money supply will decrease. Money supply will decrease. So this line will shift to the left, as we know. So we have a new income here. So here, this LM star will shift to the left. Okay? That's what's happening. Alright? So now that we know that, so with P1, we have here a dot in this graph, P1, Y1. When we get to P2, we have a new dot, because we have P2 and lower output. So let me come this way. So this is the first dot, this is the second dot, then we connect the two dots and we have the AD curve. Okay, so why is the AD curve downward sloping? Because the increase in prices decreases money supply, which, given decreases money supply, so it will shift the LM curve to the left, and because of that, the real exchange rate goes up, right? When the LM curve shifts to the left, the real exchange rate goes up. Due to this increase in the real exchange rate, net exports fall and output falls as well. So that's the chain of events that explains why the AD curve is downward sloping in the case of the Mander-Fleming model. Remember, in the closed economy, the AD curve was downward sloping. Why? Because an increase in the price level would decrease money supply, which would increase the interest rates, decrease investment and output. Here it works through the exchange rate. The decrease in money supply increases the real exchange rate, and therefore it will decrease net exports and output. Any question on this one? No. Okay. So, in the long run, okay, so if we start with the given price level, then we have, say, a situation where equilibrium output is below full capacity, the full employment. Okay, so what will happen to prices? They will start falling, right? As prices start falling, which means this short-run supply, which for simplicity we assume flat, the assumption of fixed prices in the short run, it's equivalent, remember, to a flat short-run aggregate supply. So this will start falling down, and as that happens, what happens here? This will start shifting to the right, okay?
Interest rates will fall, and that will cause higher exports, which will increase output.
Which will increase output. Very good. Exactly. So you no longer need to stand here. You can as well step and complete. That's what happened. Okay? That's the adjustment. So the adjustment to the long run adjustment, if you like, it's through this mechanism. And now we have to take a decision. So we have here, that's all I want to say about the Mander-Fleming model. So we have to, are you tired? So we need to decide whether to stop here or whether we want to open a new page and spend another 15 minutes on the new topic. If you are particularly tired, I will stop here. I see the heads are making crazy movement. If you are particularly tired, let me finish my sentence. I can stop here. If not, if you're just a little bit tired, not too much, then I can move on to the new topic.
Let's stop it.
Sorry? Very tired. There was a lot going on, right? Okay. Let's stop here then.